The ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York smelled like white roses and ambition. Every chandelier had been polished, every napkin folded into a perfect swan. The guest list read like a who's who of Toronto's financial district. Venture capitalists, tech founders, the kind of people who flew to Davos not as attendees but as speakers. And at the center of it all, laughing too loud with a champagne flute in his hand, stood Derek Harmon. He had chosen this venue on purpose. That was the thing people didn't understand about Derek. He never did anything without a reason, without calculation, without imagining how it would look from across a room. He had chosen the Fairmont because it was where they had spent their 10th anniversary, where Cecilia had worn that green dress and told him, quietly over the amuse-bouche, that she believed in him more than she believed in anyone alive. He had chosen it so she would remember that night when she walked in. He wanted her to feel the distance. 3 years earlier, Cecilia Harmon had been exactly what people in Toronto called quietly impressive. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't the kind of woman who walked into rooms and made noise. She was a financial analyst at Meridian Capital, good enough at her job that she had been named to the firm's internal advisory board at 34, which was not something that happened to many people, and almost never to women. She wore her hair natural, kept her desk clean, and sent her mother flowers on the first of every month without fail. She had met Derek at a fundraiser for the Sick Kids Foundation. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, fully present, genuinely funny, and completely focused on you for exactly as long as he needed to be. She had not been naive. She had simply been optimistic, which she would later understand is not the same thing. They married 2 years later, a small ceremony at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Her mother cried. His mother drank. For the first 4 years, things were good. Not perfect. Derek was ambitious in a way that sometimes felt like absence, a man always leaning toward the next thing, but good. Real. When he started Harmon Capital Ventures, she was the one who stayed up with him going over pitch decks. She restructured his personal finances so the company could stay liquid through its first difficult year. She introduced him to Kenneth Bonsu, a pension fund manager she knew from Meridian, who became Harmon Capital's first major institutional investor. She did all of this while keeping her own job. While cooking most nights, because Derek said takeout gave him brain fog. While managing the household and the accountant and the property taxes on the house in Rosedale that they had bought together, her name on the deed, her credit rating that had made the mortgage possible. She did all of it without complaint, because she thought that was what partnership looked like. She was wrong. The first sign was Ingrid. Ingrid Lowe was 26 years old, a communications associate at a PR firm that Harmon Capital had hired to manage its public profile. She was the kind of beautiful that made people around her slightly nervous, not because of anything she did, but because of what her presence seemed to imply. Derek began mentioning her in passing. Ingrid suggested we change the press release timeline. Ingrid had a great idea about the optics of the Series B announcement. Small things. The kind of things you could dismiss if you were looking for reasons to dismiss them. Cecilia was not looking for reasons. She was busy. The confirmation came on a Tuesday in November, when she found a hotel receipt in the pocket of Derek's suit jacket while putting it in for dry cleaning. The Hazelton. 2 nights, a date that corresponded to a weekend he had told her he was in Vancouver for a conference. She sat down on the bed with the receipt in her hand and was very quiet for a long time. She did not cry. Not yet. She had a presentation at 8 the next morning, and she had learned, over 37 years, of being Cecilia Adora Nwosu. Her maiden name, the name she had kept professionally even after the wedding, that falling apart was a privilege you sometimes had to schedule. She scheduled it for Thursday. What she did not know, and would not know for another 6 weeks, was that Derek had already spoken to a lawyer, not because he felt guilty, not because he wanted out in any honest, uncomplicated way, but because Derek had run the numbers, the way he ran all numbers, and had decided that a clean separation, initiated by him on his timeline, was financially preferable to waiting until Cecilia discovered the affair on her own terms and responded accordingly. He knew her. He knew she was smart. He knew that if she was given time to prepare, she would be formidable. So he moved first. The papers arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered by a process server to her office at Meridian. Her assistant, a young woman named Bea, handed her the envelope with an expression that suggested she already knew what was inside. Word travels fast in small offices. Derek had apparently told his own assistant before telling his wife. The divorce terms were aggressive. His lawyer had structured the agreement to minimize her claim on Harmon Capital, arguing that the company's current valuation had been achieved after certain key investments that were not connected to any direct financial contribution from Cecilia. It was, technically, arguable. It was also a lie, or at least a profound distortion. And she knew it, and she suspected Derek knew it too. But knowing something and being able to prove it in family court in Ontario are two very different things. She hired Diane Moreau, a family law litigator on Bay Street who was known for two things: never raising her voice and never losing. Diane was expensive. Cecilia liquidated a portion of her RRSP to pay the retainer, accepted the tax hit, and went to work. The process took 14 months. During that time, Derek moved Ingrid into the Rosedale house, their house, the one Cecilia's credit had purchased, which was not technically legal while the property was in dispute, and which Diane noted formally, twice, in letters that Derek's lawyer chose not to respond to in a timely fashion. During that time, Derek gave 2 interviews to business publications, in which he described himself as a self-made entrepreneur and spoke, at length, about his vision and his grind and his sacrifice, without mentioning once the woman who had restructured his personal finances and introduced him to his first major investor and made him dinner while he pitched to venture funds on his laptop at the kitchen table. Cecilia read both interviews on her phone, alone in her apartment on Queen West. She had moved out of the Rosedale house because living there with the knowledge of what had happened inside it had started to affect her sleep, and she felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not quite anger, more like the sensation of being erased while still alive. She kept working. She kept sending her mother flowers on the 1st of every month. She did not, during those 14 months, tell anyone how bad it actually was. The settlement came through in February. Diane got her a better outcome than Derek's lawyer had anticipated, a meaningful share of the appreciated value of the Rosedale property, a lump sum payment that acknowledged her indirect contribution to Harmon Capital's early growth and her legal fees covered. It was not everything she deserved. Diane was honest about that, but it was enough to matter, and it was done, and Cecilia signed the papers on a Wednesday morning, and then sat in the parking garage of the office tower for 11 minutes before she felt ready to drive. She was 38 years old and starting over. For the first few months after the divorce was final, life was very small. She went to work. She called her mother. She ran along the waterfront on weekends, past the harborfront and along the lake, sometimes as far as Sunnyside. The cold air off Lake Ontario cutting into her face in a way that felt, if not good, at least honest. She had lunch one afternoon in March with her former colleague Theo Assunte, who had left Meridian to start his own boutique advisory firm focused on impact investing. He had reached out casually, just catching up, but over their food at a small restaurant on King Street he asked, without preamble, whether she had ever considered going out on her own. She told him she had not. He told her she should. She thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she called him back. Asante and Nwosu Advisory launched in September of that year, operating initially from a shared office space in the financial district. Theo brought relationships. Cecilia brought structure, analytical depth, and an instinct for risk assessment that had been sharpened, she sometimes thought, by surviving the previous few years. Within 6 months they had 3 institutional clients. Within a year they had 7, including 2 pension funds and a mid-sized insurance group out of Calgary. Within 18 months, they were profitable enough that they moved into their own space. A proper office, with windows that looked out over the city, and a reception area where there were always fresh flowers on the desk. Her mother visited in November and stood in the middle of the office and cried, which was her mother's way of expressing that she was very proud. Cecilia stood beside her and thought, I built this, not with anyone's help, not because someone rescued her, because she had stayed in the work when the work was the only thing that made sense, and because she had known, even in the parking garage on that February morning, that she was not finished. The invitation arrived in the spring. It came by email, which felt deliberately impersonal, though perhaps that was reading too much into a mail merge. It was an invitation to the Harmon Capital Annual Investor Gala, Derek's version of a celebration dinner, which he had started hosting 2 years into the company's growth, as a way of thanking his investors and, Cecilia always suspected, of reminding them what their money had helped build. He had held it every year since, growing more elaborate each time. This year's gala was at the Fairmont Royal York. The invitation included a personal note, appended below the formal text. It said, "Cecilia, I know this is unusual, but I wanted you to be there. We've both moved on. I think it would be good for everyone to see that." She read the note 3 times. She understood exactly what it meant. Derek wanted her there because her presence, looking, he imagined, diminished, made his success more visible. He wanted his investors to see his ex-wife, quietly alone, wearing something that wasn't quite as good as what she used to wear, and to understand the distance between her world and his. He wanted a prop. He wanted her to be the evidence of how far he had come. She sat with the invitation for 4 days. Then she called Theo. Theo had a different read on it. "You know what I think," he said, leaning back in his chair across from her desk. "I think you go. And I think you bring your numbers. My numbers, the Q4 results, the new client deck. What we just signed with the Calgary group." He tilted his head. "Let him do his little presentation. And then let his investors figure out for themselves that the woman in the room built her own firm to comparable scale in 18 months, while he had 10 years and a head start." Cecilia looked at him for a moment. "You're saying I should just show up?" "I'm saying you should just show up." She thought about the Fairmont, about the green dress and the amuse-bouche, and 10 years of believing in someone who had spent those years deciding she was useful rather than essential. "I need to make a call first," she said. The call was to Simone Okafor-Baptiste. Simone was 43, a former Crown attorney who had left the public sector 4 years earlier to run Okafor-Baptiste Capital, a private equity firm that had become, in a relatively short time, one of the more talked-about independent firms in Toronto's financial community. She was brilliant, precise, and possessed of a quality that Cecilia had noticed the first time they met at a Women in Finance event. She never seemed to be performing anything. She was simply, consistently, entirely herself. They had been introduced through a mutual contact 8 months earlier. They had had coffee, then lunch, then a longer dinner at a restaurant on Ossington, where they talked for nearly 4 hours about markets and regulation, and what it actually meant to build something that lasted. They had been, since then, in regular contact, professional, warm, occasionally personal, in the way that real friendships eventually become. Cecilia had been about to ask Simone's firm about a potential collaboration, a co-advisory arrangement on a specific client file that would benefit from Okafor-Baptiste's infrastructure expertise. The conversation had been scheduled for the following month. "I have a slightly unusual request," Cecilia said, when Simone picked up. There was a pause. "Those are usually the most interesting ones," Simone said. Cecilia told her about the gala, about Derek, about the invitation and what she believed it was designed to accomplish. She was direct about it, because Simone was not a person you approached indirectly. When she was done, Simone was quiet for a moment. "You want me to come with you, I think," Cecilia said carefully. "That walking in alone is exactly what he's counting on." Another pause. Then, "Can I wear whatever I want?" Cecilia laughed for the first time in what felt like several days. "Absolutely." "Then yes," Simone said. "I'll come." "And Cecilia, let's announce the collaboration that night, properly. If his investors are going to be in the room, they should know." On the evening of the gala, Cecilia stood in front of the mirror in her apartment and looked at herself for a long moment. She was wearing a dress the color of deep ocean water. Not trying to be dramatic, just something that fit well and that she genuinely liked. Her hair was down. She had borrowed earrings from her mother that had belonged to her grandmother, small gold drops that caught the light when she moved. She did not look like a woman who had come to prove something. She looked like a woman who no longer needed to. Simone picked her up in a town car. Simone's standard arrangement, not a performance, just how she moved through the city, and they rode to the Fairmont together, talking about a client meeting they both had the following week. Normal conversation. Easy. The car stopped on Front Street. The doorman opened the door, and Cecilia Adaora Nwosu stepped out. She heard the room before she entered it. The ballroom was full, Perhaps 200 people. The kind of crowd that hums with a certain frequency. The specific pitch of money and confidence and champagne consumed before dinner. She recognized several faces near the entrance. A pension fund manager she had met at a conference. A tech founder whose company she had briefly considered as a client. 2 people from her old firm at Meridian. And then she saw Derek. He was standing near the bar on the far side of the room, Ingrid beside him, in a white dress, a glass in his hand. He was mid-law when he looked toward the entrance, the automatic glance that hosts do, the reflex of surveillance. He saw her. The laugh did not immediately stop, but it shifted. Something behind his eyes recalibrated. Cecilia held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked away. She was not here for him. Simone touched her arm lightly as they moved into the room, and Cecilia noticed, in the peripheral way you notice things when your attention is being pulled in multiple directions, that people were looking. Not with pity, she had steeled herself for pity, but with something more like curiosity. Like they were trying to update a calculation they had already run, and were finding that the numbers no longer added up. The pension fund manager, whose name was Howard Finch, reached them first. "Cecilia," he said, extending his hand, "it's been a while. I heard you started something new. Asante and Nwosu," she said. "We're just over a year in." "And this," Howard said, turning slightly towards Simone. "Simone Okafor Baptiste," Simone said, in the tone of someone who is accustomed to introducing herself in rooms that are already familiar with her name. Howard blinked. "Okafor Baptiste Capital." "The same." The recalculation was visible. The shift in Howard's posture, the slight widening of his attention, the look he gave the 2 of them together that said, "These 2 know each other." "We're actually announcing a collaboration tonight," Cecilia said. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just in the normal register of someone sharing relevant, professional news. Co-advisory on select institutional mandates. We'll have more details next week. Howard nodded slowly. Yes. I'd like to hear more about that." "We'd love to set something up," Simone said. They moved through the room. It happened gradually, the way most significant things happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small ones that accumulated until they became unmistakable. By the time dinner began, Cecilia had spoken to 11 people, 7 of whom were in the room as Harmon Capital investors or prospective investors. She had not sought any of them out. She had simply been present, answered questions honestly, and allowed the fact of Simone's company to do what it naturally did, which was to signal that she was not a woman standing alone in a room where she did not belong. She belonged in every room she entered. She had always belonged. It had taken her longer than it should have to understand that the people who tried to make you feel otherwise were usually the ones who needed the contrast. Derek approached her during the cocktail hour, before dinner was served. Ingrid was not with him. He had the measured look of a man who had rehearsed this moment, but was already sensing that it was not going the way the rehearsal had suggested. "Cecilia," he said, "I'm glad you came." She looked at him. He was still handsome, still held himself well, still had the particular ease of a man who had never had to wonder whether he deserved to be in the room. She felt very little looking at him. Not anger, not grief, not the old familiar pull. Something more like distance. Like looking at a city you used to live in from the window of a plane. "It's a beautiful event," she said. "The venue suits it." He heard what she meant. She could see it land. "How are things?" he asked. The question was cautious, exploratory. She said, "Really good, actually. We're announcing a partnership tonight. Asante and Nwosu and Okafor Baptiste Capital should reach a few of your investors." She paused, which works out nicely, having everyone in the same room. Derek looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Right," he said finally. "That's good for you." And then, because he was a man who always needed the last word to feel like a step forward rather than a retreat, he added, "You always were good at the work." She let that sit between them for a second. "Yes," she said. "I was." She left him standing there and went to find Simone. The announcement was not planned as drama. There was no moment where Cecilia commandeered a microphone or interrupted Derek's prepared remarks. She was not built for theatrical revenge and had never wanted it. What happened was simpler, and in its own way, more complete. Between the salad course and the main, Howard Finch, on his own initiative, because Howard was the kind of man who acted on information, mentioned the Asante and Nwosu, Okafor Baptiste collaboration to the 3 people at his table, two of whom were major limited partners in Harmon Capital's second fund. By the time dessert was served, the information had circulated through the room, the way information always circulates in rooms like this. Quietly, efficiently, and with accumulating weight. Several people requested cards. Two asked for meetings. One pension fund manager from Edmonton, a woman named Patricia who had arrived at the gala as Derek's guest, found Cecilia near the end of the evening and introduced herself with the specific energy of someone who has decided they want to do business together. Cecilia took her card and gave her one of her own. Across the ballroom, she saw Derek watching. He had the expression of a man who had organized a particular event and found that the event had developed its own agenda, one over which he had no control. She thought about the invitation. "I wanted you to be there. I think it would be good for everyone to see that." He had wanted everyone to see something, and everyone had, just not what he'd planned. Ingrid left Derek 11 months later, which Cecilia learned not from anyone close to either of them, but from a brief item in a business gossip column that she read by accident while looking for something else. The column mentioned, in passing, that Harmon Capital had lost two of its major institutional investors to what the writer described as shifting portfolio priorities, which Cecilia understood was the polite way of saying that the due diligence had not been favorable. She did not feel satisfaction, exactly. Or not only satisfaction. She felt something more like clarity. The sense of a long equation finally resolving into its correct answer. She was 40 years old. She ran a firm. She had a proper office with windows and fresh flowers, and a team of 4 people who were genuinely good at their jobs and who she tried every day to treat with the honesty and seriousness she had once given so freely to someone who had not deserved it. She still called her mother on Sundays, still ran along the waterfront when the weather permitted, still sent flowers on the first of the month, because some habits are worth keeping, and because the particular pleasure of making her mother happy was one of the few things in her life that had required no reassessment. One afternoon in October, almost exactly 2 years after the gala, she sat at her desk after a long day and looked out at the city through her window. The lake was visible from where she sat, a thin gray line at the edge of the sky, barely there in the autumn light. She had grown up looking at that lake, had run beside it during the worst year of her life, had looked at it from the window of a parking garage on a February morning when she had been not quite sure yet what came next. She knew now. She turned off her desk lamp and put on her coat and went home. The city was already going dark around her, the lights coming on in the office towers, and somewhere in the distance the lake, holding its cold, steady line. She walked through it without hurrying. She had learned not to hurry through things that were worth feeling. She had built something real. She had survived something that was supposed to diminish her, and had come out the other side not harder exactly, but clearer, with a better understanding of what she was made of, and what she was willing to accept, and what she would never again mistake for love. The 1st of November was 3 weeks away. She would send her mother flowers.